At long last, week one of the fantasy football season is here and already experiencing some really intense emotions. Maybe you're a Mark Andrews manager who's panicking about his dud on Thursday Night Football. Maybe you're an Xavier Worthy manager who's kicking yourself for leaving his 2 touchdowns on the bench. Or maybe you're just riddled with uncertainty and fear and self-doubt when deciding who should and shouldn't be in your week one fantasy football lineup. Let's talk about it all right here, right now, in episode 35 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. What's up, my friend? It's Mikey Henninger from Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, and today we are going to talk week one of fantasy football. Of course, we're going to talk upcoming games and start-sit conundrums, but before we dive into that, we have to address the Mark Andrews-sized elephant that's in the room. Now, I'm seeing a lot of fantasy football players that are just straight up panicking after Mark Andrews caught just 2 of 2 targets for just 14 scoreless yards, aka 3.4 PPR points in Thursday night's loss to the Kansas City Chiefs. And that panic has been seemingly 10x'd by the fact that the other tight end in Baltimore, Isaiah Likely, caught a whopping 9 of 12 targets for 111 yards and 1 touchdown, aka 26.1 PPR points. There is a lot of panic surrounding Mark Andrews and whether or not he's been straight up replaced by Isaiah Likely moving forward. In fact, one of my subscribers woke up in cold sweats and posted in our fantasy football Discord server, and I quote, "So, can I drop Mark Andrews? Pretty alarming game last night. He was a decoy, he was a run blocker, and Isaiah Likely was the preferred target. Am I overreacting, or should you get off the Mark Andrews train while you still can?" Now, don't worry, we've since talked him off the ledge. He's even posted since then, "Follow me for more violent overreactions." But let me be clear, in case anybody else is even thinking that way, do not drop Mark Andrews. In fact, don't panic at all. Because here's the thing. Isaiah Likely being awesome does not mean that Mark Andrews won't be. It's not the sort of thing where Isaiah Likely took over and replaced Mark Andrews in week one. Now, both guys are listed as tight ends. So I can understand how somebody would think, oh, there's a new number 1 tight end in Baltimore. I can understand that, but that's not quite how it works. It's not the sort of thing where Mark Andrews got benched. It's not the sort of thing where Isaiah Likely came in and just took over and replaced Mark Andrews. In fact, Mark Andrews played more offensive snaps and he ran more routes for Lamar Jackson than Isaiah Likely did last night. In fact, credit PFF's Nate Yonke. He charted Mark Andrews with 59 offensive snaps and 38 routes run compared to 53 offensive snaps and 35 routes run for Isaiah Likely. Now, don't completely disregard Isaiah Likely. We're definitely going to talk about him in just 1 minute. But the point that I'm trying to make right here, right now, is that if you are a Mark Andrews manager in 2024 fantasy football, please do not panic after what you saw on Thursday night. He was still out there. He was on the field. He played plenty of snaps, ran plenty of routes. It was just the sort of thing that, A, the Baltimore Ravens ran 2 tight end sets a ton, a lot more than they have in previous years. And B, the Kansas City Chiefs prepared for and planned for Mark Andrews. He is going to get his. Do not panic. Do not drop him. And if you're not a Mark Andrews manager in 2024, well, then you have an awesome opportunity in front of you. You see, there's 2 types of fantasy football players in this world. There are the people who panic and overreact after one game, and there are the people who take advantage of the people who panic and overreact after one game. What I'm trying to say is this is an opportunity for you, if you're not a Mark Andrews manager, to go out and put some feelers out, make some trade offers for Mark Andrews, because there is a possibility that the Mark Andrews manager in your league is panicking after what he saw Mark Andrews did compared to what Isaiah Likely did. It can't hurt to put some trade offers out there. Oh, and by the way, what you saw from Isaiah Likely on Thursday Night Football was not a fluke. Isaiah Likely essentially served as Baltimore's slot wide receiver. He was very clearly one of Lamar Jackson's top targets, one of the guys he was looking for. Isaiah Likely is going to be in a very, very fantasy-friendly role in 2024 fantasy football. So whereas Mark Andrews looks like a terrific buy low candidate in fantasy football, Isaiah Likely is not a sell high. His role, his usage looks rather legitimate. He is going to be a player in 2024 fantasy football leagues, and he absolutely deserves to be a top priority in week 1 waiver claims, which historically tends to be the most important waiver wire run of the entire season. But again, the entire point of all of this is that Isaiah Likely being awesome does not mean that Mark Andrews won't also be awesome. This isn't a one or the other type of situation. Both of these guys can coexist, and both of these guys will coexist in 2024 fantasy football leagues. For what it's worth, while you're listening to this on podcast or watching this on YouTube a couple days after the fact, I addressed all of this instantly the very moment that it came up inside my fantasy football Discord server. My fantasy football Discord server is an online community, an online army of 192 and counting other fantasy football players that are hanging out, talking ball, swapping strategy, and ultimately helping each other dominate their fantasy football leagues. It's also where I'm hanging out all season, all year, really, talking ball, sharing strategy, and of course, sharing my exclusive research and my exclusive insights the very moment that I find them. So come hang out with me, come hang out with us this fantasy football season. You can join us by visiting patreon.com/basementbroodff or just use the link that we left for you in the show notes. All right, so let's move on to some week 1 start or sit conundrums that were sent to me from my subscribers inside of my Discord server. Now, before we dive into some very specific dilemmas, I want to talk really quickly about the importance of process and focusing on process as opposed to focusing on results. And I'm going to use a very specific example straight out of my Discord server. So prior to Thursday night's game, one of my subscribers, Jay Boogie, asked, should I stick with Scary Terry in the flex? He, to me, has the best path to targets, even though Xavier Worthy is tempting. Now, the Basement Brood Fantasy Football community, myself included, my week 1 heat map, everything recommended sticking with Terry McLaurin as opposed to going with Xavier Worthy. And as you know, the flashy rookie ended up scoring not 1, but 2 touchdowns on Thursday Night Football, which of course can be very uncomfortable. It can be tilting. It can be really frustrating to watch somebody score 2 touchdowns on your bench and not collect those points. I totally get that. Hindsight is 2020, and it's really easy to look back and say, well, I should have went with Xavier Worthy. He scored 2 touchdowns. I totally get that. And it's important to recognize in fantasy football, just like in betting and most other things in life, you're not going to bat 1,000. You're not going to get it right every single time. There's very much an element of luck that plays into this game and unpredictability that plays into this game. But fantasy football is all about giving yourself the best chance to win, using the information, using the data that you have at the time to make the best possible decisions and give yourself the best opportunity to win. And in this case, the process and the decision would lead to Terry McLaurin. You had Xavier Worthy, who entering the game had a bit of an unclear role. We weren't exactly sure how the Chiefs were going to use him. We don't have any data to lean on. We knew at best he would likely be third in line for targets behind Rashee Rice and Travis Kelce. He was going up against a Baltimore Ravens defense that held enemy wide receivers to the 7th fewest PPR points per game last season. Okay, so there's a lot of question marks, a lot of things that we just did not know about Xavier Worthy compared to a guy like Terry McLaurin, who is very clearly the number 1 option in the Washington Commanders passing game. There's almost no other competition for targets. He's very easily going to lead the Commanders in targets this season. He's playing with the best quarterback that he's ever had in his entire career. He's going up against a Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense that allowed the 8th most PPR points to enemy wide receivers last year, and his Commanders are expected to be playing from behind theoretically increasing the passing volume and the target potential for Terry McLaurin. So yes, going into Thursday Night Football, Terry McLaurin was the correct choice. Process should lead you to Terry McLaurin instead of Xavier Worthy. And again, I get it. Watching a guy score 2 touchdowns on your bench is frustrating, but I don't think there was anybody on the planet that came in expecting 2 touchdowns from Xavier Worthy. Likewise, one of my other subscribers in my Discord server asked me this morning, after the fact, after Xavier Worthy scored 2 touchdowns. He said, hindsight is 2020, and obviously now it's too late, but I'm definitely curious. Would you have started Xavier Worthy over Cooper Kupp, Nico Collins, or Mike Evans? It hurts to have so many points sitting on my bench. And the answer is no. There's no world in which I would have chosen Xavier Worthy over Cooper Kupp in a shootout with the Lions, who allowed the 3rd most PPR points per game last year. I wouldn't have chosen him over Nico Collins, who's in a possible shootout with the Indianapolis Colts, and I wouldn't have chosen him over Mike Evans, who is going against a Washington Commanders defense that allowed the 2nd most PPR points per game last year to opposing wide receivers. There's just not a world where I would have chosen Xavier Worthy over any of those guys. And that's coming from somebody who loves Xavier Worthy. I talked him up in my pre-draft show. I talked him up in my post-draft show. I talked him up in my draft guide. I love Xavier Worthy. I think he's obviously insanely fast, but he's also a terrific wide receiver. He's with Patrick Mahomes. I went so far as to call him Patrick Mahomes' next Tyreek Hill. But still, entering week 1, there's zero world in which I would have chosen Xavier Worthy over Terry McLaurin, Cooper Kupp, Nico Collins, or Mike Evans. And I'm fine with that. I can live with that because I know that the process was correct. And if it wasn't, I will make small adjustments, because the idea is if you're following the right process every single week, if you're putting yourself in the best possible position to win with the data and the information that you have, you're going to get it right more often than you get it wrong, and it's going to pay dividends in the long run. One of my most active subscribers inside my Discord server, in fact, he's a Discord server team captain because of how active he is, and more importantly, because of how sharp, how smart he is as a fantasy football player. This guy has taken down multiple DFS contests. Very, very valuable to be able to get inside his brain in my Discord server. But he wrote something so perfectly about process inside my Discord server that I'm basically going to just read it to you almost verbatim. Derek Devereaux said, "Elite fantasy football players question process decisions against process rather than against results." So in other words, they're asking themselves, did I make the right decision with the information I had when I made the decision, instead of, did I predict outcomes correctly? Elite fantasy football players are using results to influence process. They're using results to marginally adjust process moving forward, building a sample size of information that's more than just one game, and then they just do that same exercise over and over and over again every week throughout the season, getting better and better with their process as the season moves along. And that's the idea. It's just like almost anything else in life, right? Not everything is going to go according to plan. There's going to be bumps in the road. But if you have a sound process that you're able to consistently follow day after day, week after week, month after month, and if you're able to improve that process along the way, you're going to be successful. And it's the same thing for fantasy football. All right, now that we've discussed the importance of process, let's dive into some of these start-sit conundrums that were sent to me from my subscribers inside my Discord server. But first, after talking process, after talking the heartache of Mark Andrews, the heartache of talking Xavier Worthy being on your bench, I need to grab a beer. Are you a software wizard? A code ninja? A forge master? Or maybe even just a mad scientist? Then come build your career ladder with Infinity Labs, an award-winning technology company, best place to work, and business of the year with best-in-class benefits and compensation. Visit i-labs.tech. That's i-labs.tech today, where you can learn more about Infinity Labs, our expanding national presence, and why the status quo has no hold on us. All right, so massive massive shout out to Mr. Mark Vandeloo from Jacksonville, Florida. Mark is the owner of Ruby Beach Brewing. He's also a Basement Brewed Fantasy Football subscriber. Mark is awesome. Mark saw and he heard and he read about my payment processing woes that I was dealing with a couple weeks back. Long story short, my payment processor decided that me making fantasy football spreadsheets was too close to online gambling, and they just shut down my account in the middle of August, right when fantasy football drafts are happening. There was no way for me to collect payments for my business at its most critical, most busy time. So being the fellow entrepreneur that he is, Mark sent me a 6-pack of beers from his brewery, which is Ruby Beach Brewing down in Jacksonville. So any of you Jacksonville listeners, you've probably already familiar, and if you're not, definitely check it out. But I purposely did not try any of them because I wanted to drink it live, live even though this was recorded, for the first time here with you guys so I can give it a little bit of a review. I'm in Milwaukee, okay? This is like brewing central. They literally call it the Brew City for a reason. Our baseball team's called the Brewers. So I like to think I'm a solid critic for beer. I'm going to be trying a Flying Saucer, it's an American lager. It's apparently the official beer of the Jacksonville Icemen hockey team, so that's always pretty cool. But let me pour it in my frosted Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. Ooh, I like that color. It's a little bit more yellow than I was expecting, which isn't a bad thing. I like that. Yellow's literally my favorite color. Really good looking pour here. Looking forward to this one. Thanks again, Mark. This is such an awesome gesture. I got to tell you, man, I was in such a terrible mood with all the payment processing stuff. This whole running a business thing is so much more challenging, so much more difficult than anybody can possibly prepare for. So I'll tell you what, man, you sending the 6-pack of beer from your brewery, it made my day, it made my week. The beer was exciting, but it was also, Mark included a note, and in the note he said, keep getting off the mat. And I can't tell you how much I appreciated that, because as an entrepreneur, you get knocked down a lot. So anyways, here goes. Flying Saucer American Lager from Ruby Beach Brewing. Man. Okay. Yep. That is a good one. And I promise I'm not just saying that because Mark's a nice guy or because I'm a nice guy. That is genuinely a very, very good beer. That is one that I would order if I was at a restaurant. It's definitely one I'll order if I'm down in Jacksonville. So if you are in the Jacksonville area, try the Flying Saucer, but definitely try any of his beers. He sent me a sour, which isn't really my thing, but my wife was really excited about it. He sent me an IPA, a Mexican lager, which I'm excited about. I love Mexican lagers. So anyways, Mark, Ruby Beach Brewing, dude, I super appreciate that. And by the way, this is not a paid advertisement. This is just a really cool thing that Mark did, and I wanted to be able to try the beer for the first time with all of you. So Mark, Ruby Beach Brewing, thank you so much. I can't tell you how much you literally made my week when I got that. Thank you. All right, let's get into some of these start-sit dilemmas that my subscribers inside my Discord server have sent me, and they've posted inside the start-sit channel inside of that Discord server. Now, the first one on my list is Baker Mayfield versus Aaron Rodgers. If you're watching on YouTube, what you see on the screen currently is a weekly resource that I put together for my subscribers. It's called the Weekly Heat Map, and it's intended to help you conquer these impossible lineup decisions when you're creating your own lineups. And for context, just to be clear, this tool, this resource, this is the resource that launched my entire business, my entire company, after it went viral. So this is the resource that Basement Brewed Fantasy Football subscribers are using when they need to conquer really difficult lineup setting situations, if they need to identify streamers that they can grab off waivers and plug into their lineup, if they're looking for a sleeper that can go off on a bigger week than normal. This is the resource that they're using. All right, so let's talk Baker Mayfield versus Aaron Rodgers. Which one should he put in the lineup? Which one should he leave on the bench? Now, let's start with Baker Mayfield, right? He's the quarterback of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We'll see here on the heat map that this week in particular, he's going to be at home against the Washington Commanders in a decent scoring game. It's not especially a high-scoring game or a low-scoring game. They're right in the middle of the pack. They're right about average. In fact, the 43.5 point over-under is the exact same as Aaron Rodgers and the Jets, 43.5 against the 49ers. We see that Baker Mayfield and his Buccaneers, they're expected to win at home by 3.5. They're favored. The spread is 3.5. Their implied point total, so when you take their over-under and the spread and you figure out the amount of points that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are expected to score in week 1, is about 23.5, which is pretty solid, and it's especially more than the New York Jets, Aaron Rodgers' football team, right? We see that the Buccaneers are expected to score about 23, 24, and the Jets are only expected to score about 19, 20, okay? Advantage, Baker Mayfield, at least in that regard. Then you see that last year's Washington Commanders, you see this number 1 underneath quarterback next to Washington Commanders. That suggests that last year, because we don't have this year, we don't have 2024 data yet, that suggests, or that tells you that last year's Washington Commanders allowed the number 1 most fantasy points per game to enemy quarterbacks. So quarterbacks scored more points against the Commanders than they did against any other team, and that is who Baker Mayfield is going against this week. Now, on the other hand, Aaron Rodgers is going against the 49ers, who have a 26 underneath quarterback next to their name, meaning the 49ers held enemy quarterbacks to the 7th fewest fantasy points per game. It's going to be a much tougher environment for Aaron Rodgers in San Francisco than it is going to be for Baker Mayfield in Tampa Bay. Of course, these numbers, these are going to change as the season goes on and we start gathering some 2024 data. All right, so at the team level, big advantage to Baker Mayfield, right? His Buccaneers have a higher implied total. He personally has a better matchup against the Commanders. He's at home while Aaron Rodgers is on the road. So at the team level, so far, the advantage is Baker Mayfield. But let's look at the individual level. So in the heat map, there's 2 ways that you can find the player that you're looking for. Number 1, a simple Control F or search. You can start typing in the player's name and you'll be able to find them. Or number 2, each game is labeled with a number right next to it. Right? Ravens-Chiefs was game 1, Packers-Eagles game 2. We know that the Buccaneers are going to be game 14 and the Jets are going to be game 16. So looking in these columns, we're easily going to come over and find these players. Now, we're going to start out with Baker Mayfield, who is in game 14. He is listed in column C, the meh column, meaning there's typically not too much that suggests he's going to have a great game or a terrible game. However, his bullet or the circle or the color or the dot or whatever you want to call it is green, meaning he's right on the verge of graduating from column C into column B, which would be the feel-good column. Why? If you double click on his name or just click enter, it's going to tell you pretty much everything that you need to know about Baker Mayfield in his upcoming matchup with the Washington Commanders. It's color-coded from elite and mouth-watering bullet points all the way down to scary and bad bullet points and reasons that you might not want to consider him. So starting with the top, I always include a quick little TLDR if you don't feel like reading all the information below it. Baker Mayfield is a high-quality QB2 and a high-quality streamer in week 1. But here is the why. For starters, we already talked a little bit about this. Last year's Washington Commanders were the worst team on the entire planet when it came to stopping quarterbacks. They hemorrhaged the second most passing yards, the most passing touchdowns, and the most fantasy points per game. They allowed 21.2 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks last year. Now, again, you have to take that with a grain of salt because it was last year. It's not 2024 data, it's 2023 data, and that's going to change as the season goes on. But as a starting point, that's a pretty darn good starting point. Moving down to the good, still good bullet points. Not quite mouth-watering, not quite elite, but still good. The Buccaneers are projected to score 23.5 points, which is the 11th most on the 32-team slate. Okay, the Buccaneers are expected to score more points than 20 or so other teams. They are expected to score the 11th most points out of 32 teams. Next up, Baker Mayfield revived his career in Tampa Bay. He averaged 17.2 fantasy points over 19 games last year in 2023. Again, take it with a mini grain of salt. That was last year. It's not this year. He has a different offensive coordinator, but still, that's a great starting point. He had a safe floor last year. He scored 15 or more fantasy points in 14 of the 19 games that he played, or about 74%. Really, the only bad news or the bad red flag to Baker Mayfield's profile in week 1 is that I personally am concerned that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers lost Dave Canales as their offensive coordinator. He is now the head coach of the Carolina Panthers, and if you've listened to my previous episodes, I love Dave Canales. The dude is an absolute genius. He's an offensive wizard. He is an absolute brainiac who has been able to get career years out of guys like Mike Evans, Doug Baldwin, Russell Wilson. He revived Baker Mayfield's career. He revived Geno Smith's career, and now he's no longer the offensive coordinator for the Buccaneers. I personally don't like that, but that is the only red flag. It's the only thing that's kept me a little bit lower on Baker Mayfield than most this year. Ultimately, great week, great setup for Baker Mayfield. And then you look at Aaron Rodgers, right? Game 16, we found him once again. He's in column C, but unlike Baker Mayfield, who has a green dot, Aaron Rodgers has a yellow dot, meaning his outlook just on the surface isn't as great as Baker Mayfield's. And here's why. Double click or click enter on their name. TLDR, Aaron Rodgers is a QB2 in week 1, albeit one of the few that's always capable of superstardom. We know he's a guy who can play at an MVP caliber level. It's just who Aaron Rodgers is. Now, from a mouthwatering standpoint to Aaron Rodgers' week 1 profile, just a reminder to anybody listening, I recognize that he hasn't quite been the same. Last year was a completely lost season, but just a reminder that Aaron Rodgers is a guy who's averaging in a dead even 20 fantasy points per game over his 233 game career. Okay. Last year was a lost year. He played 6 total snaps, but this dude is averaging 20 fantasy points per game in his career. This is an MVP caliber football player. Yes, he's entering his age 41 season. He's coming off an Achilles injury, but do not forget what this man is capable of. Okay. Now, as far as bad news, right? We already talked a little bit about the New York Jets are projected to score just 19.5 points. That's actually the 6th fewest on the full 32-team slate. They're going to be they're expected to be a bottom 7 scoring team in week 1. They're a team to mostly avoid in the majority of week 1 fantasy football decisions. Next up, last year's San Francisco 49ers were tough on quarterbacks, unlike the Washington Commanders. They held quarterbacks to the 14th fewest passing yards, the 13th fewest passing touchdowns, and the 7th fewest fantasy points per game. They only allowed 14.6 quarterback fantasy points per game. Last but not least, of course, we already mentioned it, Aaron Rodgers is entering his age 41 season. He's returning from an Achilles injury. All in all, there's a lot of question marks to Aaron Rodgers' week 1 profile, where Baker Mayfield's week 1 profile actually sets up quite nicely. And if it's me, forced to make this decision in my own league, I would be choosing Baker Mayfield. So my recommendation is Baker Mayfield. Aaron Rodgers takes the bench this week, although I am expecting a big season out of number 12 or number 8 or whatever he's wearing with the New York Jets. All right, Mr. Otta Baby Eats a Boy wants to know if he should be using Hunter Henry or Taysom Hill in his tight end spot in his own league. So let's start out with Hunter Henry, right? He's in Game 6. The New England Patriots are on the road visiting the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, as of right now, as of this recording, and this could change because there's a lot of uncertainty around Jamar Chase and T. Higgins right now, but as of right now, and as of this recording, the over-under on this game is dreadfully low. 40.5. It's the lowest possible number on the Week 1 slate. This is projected to be the lowest scoring game in all of Week 1. The Patriots in particular have an implied total of just 16 points, which, by the way, the Cincinnati Bengals are my top streaming defense of the week in Week 1. So the Patriots are only projected to score about 16 points, not a lot of touchdowns. That's already a detriment to Hunter Henry's potential value. However, last year's Cincinnati Bengals allowed the 3rd most PPR points per game to opposing tight ends. That's a good thing for Hunter Henry. Also, a good thing for Hunter Henry is the spread. The New England Patriots are 8.5-point underdogs. That's a pretty wide spread, one that suggests the Cincinnati Bengals should run away with the game pretty easily, thereby potentially increasing the target volume for all Patriots pass catchers as they have to abandon the run and put the ball in the air, trying to keep up with or at least catch up to the Cincinnati Bengals. So that's good news for the target volume. So that's good news for the target volume for Hunter Henry, and the Bengals allowing the third most PPR points per game last year. That's good news for potential efficiency, possibility of touchdowns. We'll dive into that in just a minute. Meanwhile, Taysom Hill is the other option for tight end. Now, the Saints are also locked in a low-scoring game. Their over-under is just 41.5. That's one of the gross low-scoring games of the week. But they are favored. They're favored by 3.5, and that is notable considering Taysom Hill himself gets rushing opportunity out of the Saints' backfield, especially with Kendre Miller. Kendre Miller on IR. They could be looking for more players to be able to run the ball. Now, this portion of the heat map is entirely useless for the heat map. It really doesn't matter how teams performed against quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, because while Taysom Hill is listed as a tight end or a quarterback in some cases, while he's listed as a tight end, he doesn't actually play tight end. So how teams performed against tight ends doesn't really matter. So here, of course, we want to look at the individual level. So once again, the Patriots are in their game number 6, so we look for game number 6, and here we find Hunter Henry, who's in column C, which is, again, these are guys I'm just fine with. I don't feel great about them. I don't love them. I don't hate them. They're just meh. Now, he does have a green dot, meaning there's something that's pushing him closer to column B than column D. So let's click into the Y, right? TLDR, Hunter Henry is a super-duper sneaky bet to pay fantasy football dividends in week 1. It's desperate, but I do like Hunter Henry as a week 1 streamer. And that might get you thinking, why? What do I not know about Hunter Henry? Let's dive in. That's why you double click on the name. That's why you click enter on the name. Now, from a mouth-watering standpoint, last year's Cincinnati Bengals were among the worst in football when it came to defending tight ends. They hemorrhaged the second most catches, 4th most yards, and 13th most touchdowns, and 3rd most PPR points per game, right? So they allowed less touchdowns than they did catches and yards, which sets up really nicely if Hunter Henry's Patriots aren't going to score a lot of touchdowns. If Hunter Henry can just rack up catches and yards, that could pay off in PPR leagues. Now, also working in Hunter Henry's favor, the New England Patriots currently do not have an obvious wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2, for that matter, which creates a realistic path to meaningful targets for Hunter Henry, who, don't forget, was once among the most promising tight ends in all of football. Meaning there is a possibility, it's not necessarily likely, but it's definitely possible that Hunter Henry becomes one of the top targets in the New England Patriots passing attack. Also working in Hunter Henry's favor, in 3 seasons where Jacoby Brissett, who is now the starting quarterback of the New England Patriots, in 3 seasons where he played 15 or more games, tight end David Njoku had the 3rd best statistical season of his 7-year career. Tight end Jack Doyle had the best season of his career and the 3rd best statistical season of his 9-year career. Point is, Jacoby Brissett, typically speaking, gets his tight ends the ball. He leans on his tight ends. Now, just kind of not necessarily great or bad, it's worth noting that the Patriots are heavy 8.5-point underdogs, which may increase the volume of the passing game if they're forced to abandon the run. Patriots pass catchers get a theoretical boost in the rankings. In fact, I'm going to take that right now and move that into the good column, because there's no way that's a bad thing for Hunter Henry. Now, what is working against Hunter Henry is that the Patriots and Bengals have a nauseatingly low over-under, 40.5, which is the lowest on the 16-game slate. And of course, as we talked about, the Patriots themselves are projected to score just 16 points in week 1, which is easily the lowest on the 32-team slate, and there's not many Patriots that I would want in my week 1 fantasy lineup. However, Hunter Henry just might be one of those guys. Now, that's Hunter Henry, right? We're feeling pretty good about Hunter Henry if we're in a pinch, right? I'm not saying anybody who rosters Hunter Henry needs to get him into his lineup, but if we're in a pinch, there's some appeal there. Now, Looking for Taysom Hill. Down to game 9. Here he is. Again, you can just do a simple search function and find him. He's in column C. His dot is yellow. There's nothing that's particularly exciting or not exciting about the way this game sets up for Taysom Hill. And frankly, that's likely going to be the case every single week because he is so unpredictable. But here's what we are expecting for week 1. Note, Taysom Hill's fantasy football appeal is specific to him having tight end eligibility. So if Taysom Hill's listed as a quarterback on the platform that you play, like my fantasy league has him as a quarterback, Underdog has Taysom Hill as a quarterback, he needs to be tight end specific for him to be fantasy football relevant. Okay. If you're playing on a platform where he's listed as a quarterback instead of tight end, he's much, much less valuable. But if he's a tight end, he's a possible cheat code to 2024 fantasy football. And here's why. If you look in the green, the good column, Taysom Hill had really, really exciting usage in the preseason, including plenty of action out of the backfield. He lined up in line. He lined up in the slot. He had really, really encouraging usage, looking like he's going to be a big part of the New Orleans Saints' plans in 2024. Now, the Saints themselves, they're projected to score about 23 points, which is either the 16th most or the 16th fewest on the slate, depending on whether or not you feel like being optimistic or pessimistic, but they fall right in the middle of all 32 teams. Now, Taysom Hill himself, he is the ultimate wild card in all of fantasy football. None of the traditional data points matter when it comes to trying to project Taysom Hill. His usage fluctuates from week to week. Sometimes he's heavily involved. Other times he's not involved at all. His position fluctuates week to week because sometimes he's throwing the ball, sometimes he's running the ball, sometimes he's catching the ball. So the point is, matchups really do not matter a single bit when it comes to Taysom Hill because he does not play a traditional position. He doesn't play quarterback. He doesn't play tight end. But if you're in a pinch and you need to roll the dice, Taysom Hill is about as high risk, high reward as it gets in fantasy football. Bad news working against Taysom Hill is that the Panthers at Saints carries a disgusting over-under of 41.5, which is the 4th lowest on the 16-game slate, and both teams in the slate have bottom 16 implied totals, making this a game to mostly avoid in fantasy football. So, the question of, would I rather have Hunter Henry or Taysom Hill in my week 1 lineup? The answer is Taysom Hill, because ultimately I want to swing for the fences. I want to aim for as much upside as I can possibly find, and that is with Taysom Hill. There's plenty of question marks, plenty of uncertainty, plenty of uncomfortability about putting him in my lineup, but it's not like Hunter Henry is a comfortable insertion into the lineup either. There's plenty of question marks there. Hunter Henry could turn out to be a total dud and not at all a part of the New England Patriots passing attack. There's a lot of questions there. He's coming off an injury. Neither one of these guys is particularly safe or at all safe. None of them are a sure thing. So if I have to swing the bat and roll the dice on one of them, I want to aim for the fences. I want to aim for maximum upside, and that's Taysom Hill. Anytime you get a tight end who's handling carries, who's getting targets in the slot, who's getting carries out of the backfield, who could possibly throw a touchdown, that's going to be a better bet, a better dice roll if either way you're rolling the dice on 2 uncertain tight ends. Taysom Hill's the higher upside play there. Now, if you personally are on the fence about Hunter Henry, Taysom Hill, or any other tight ends that you might be in a pinch and you need to stream in week 1, or quarterbacks, or defenses, or kickers, every week on the heat map I put a handy dandy streamers and stashes tab at the bottom. I'm working on getting this prettied up so it looks nice and looks more presentable. But in its most raw form, it's basically just a easy to access list of streamers and stashes that I would suggest heading into week 1. So if you're in a pinch looking for a defense, these are the defenses that I would recommend. Color coding at the top. Cincinnati Bengals are easily my number 1 defensive streamer of the week. Same thing goes for kickers. These are the kickers that I would recommend grabbing off waivers, plugging into your lineup if you just don't know who to start and you're looking for a kicker. By the way, I am frequently told that this particular tab is among the most useful things that I do and that I offer for my subscribers, which is not something I expected. I thought it would just be a fun little cheat sheet, but apparently this is one of the most used tabs of all of the things I offer at Basement Brood Fantasy Football. Just something to know. If you need a tight end, I got you. If you need a quarterback, I got you. This one is probably my favorite list. These are running backs to stash. Now, the strategy, the philosophy here is grabbing these running backs before kickoff so that you've already won the race to the waiver wire if anything happens in that backfield that suddenly makes that player's value go through the roof. So, for example, my number one ad that I would recommend to anybody who has one bench spot is Jordan Mason. If Jordan Mason is available in your league, add him before the 49ers kick the football on Monday night. The reason is, if, gosh forbid, knock on wood, anything were to ever happen to Christian McCaffrey, Jordan Mason would instantly be the number one ad on all waiver wires. So if he's available in your league and you have a bench spot and you can add him before the 49ers kick the football, you have already won the race to the waiver wire if anything happened to Christian McCaffrey. Come and draft some fantasy football teams with me that are specific to this week. Over on drafters.com, I'm going to be doing a ton of these things over the next couple days. It's you versus 4 other people. Everybody drafts 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and 1 flex. And whoever puts together the best team for that week wins. Again, it's over on drafters.com. And if you enter promo code BBFF when you're making your first deposit, Drafters is going to 100% match that first deposit up to $100. It's like getting a free $100 bill to play fantasy football with. That's going to be all for today's episode. If you want more, you know where to find me. I'm going to be hanging out in the basement, which is our fantasy football Discord server. We're going to be talking ball, swapping strategy, and helping each other dominate week 1. Again, you can join us using the link that we left for you in the show notes. Good luck to you in week 1. I'll see you on the fantasy football field in week 2. Cheers. This brew's for you.